Imagine a quiet evening thousands of years ago, under the same stars we see tonight. A small fire crackles gently as someone in an ancient camp tends to a bundle of dried herbs. In the warm glow, fragrant smoke curls into the air. The scene is peaceful and slow, a timeless moment of calm. In this hushed atmosphere, humanity's long relationship with cannabis is beginning. We are about to journey together through the ages with this weed, in a meditative exploration of how people have used it from antiquity to modern times. This will be a boring history for sleep, a soothing and gentle narrative to ease you into rest. Cannabis has been humanity's quiet companion for millennia. The history of its use by people stretches back into the mists of prehistory, at least as far as the 3rd millennium BC, according to written records, and possibly even to Stone Age times, before pottery was invented. For countless generations, this humble green plant has been valued in many different ways. Its tough fibers were woven into rope and cloth, its seeds pressed for food and oil, its leaves and flowers brewed into medicines, and its smoke cherished for spiritual visions or simple enjoyment. In virtually every corner of the world, across cultures as diverse as ancient Chinese villagers and African shamans, Victorian physicians, and modern musicians, cannabis has quietly found a place. In this calm historical journey, we'll travel slowly through time and around the globe. We will visit ancient Asia, where early farmers and healers first learned the plant's secrets. We'll wander through the Middle East and Egypt, listening to whispers of ritual incense and medicinal salves. We'll sit with Greeks and Romans in the classical world as they cultivate hemp for their sales and perhaps nibble on its seeds at a banquet. Then onward, we drift into the huts of African elders and the campfires of New World explorers, observing how cannabis became part of indigenous traditions in Africa and later the Americas. We will spend a dreamy evening in the medieval Islamic world, where sages and mystics pondered the effects of hashish in poetry and prayer. The story will then carry us into the colonial era and Victorian age, a time of both fascination and fear about this plant. From scholarly experiments to the first stern prohibitions, we'll gently recall the 20th century, when cannabis was outlawed and yet bloomed in counterculture scenes, a symbol of both rebellious joy and controversial stigma. Finally, we will arrive in the 21st century, witnessing a slow dawn of rediscovery as laws relax and scientific interest returns, bringing cannabis back into the light of legitimacy. Throughout this narration, the tone will remain soft and meditative. We'll pause often to paint sensory images. The sweet, herbal scent of hemp drying in an ancient field, the flicker of lamplight in a Victorian apothecary's shop where a tincture of cannabis is being poured, the distant sound of mellow laughter and a guitar at a 1,960 seconds campsite, smoke lazily rising to meet the moon. Each epoch will unfold gently, like turning the pages of an old, forgotten book. There will be historical vignettes, little stories of individuals quietly experiencing cannabis, whether a monk seeking solace or a healer mixing a remedy. These moments are meant to be soothing and immersive, helping you imagine the past without hurry or worry. If your eyelids grow heavy as we wander through these tales, that's perfectly fine. This history is designed for sleep. You can drift in and out, knowing the narrative will continue like a steady, murmuring stream. So nestle into your pillows, and let's begin our slow journey. We start at the very dawn of cannabis use. In the ancient world, where wild hemp grew on open plains and along riverbanks, waiting for curious humans to discover its gifts. In the stillness of prehistory, the story of smoking weed and more truly begins. Ancient origins, from wild herb to early cultivation. Our story opens in deep antiquity, long before written records, a time when humans were first learning to farm and to heal. In those distant days, cannabis was simply a wild plant growing on its own, swaying gently in the winds of Central Asia. Imagine a group of early gatherers walking through sun-baked grasslands near the foothills of distant mountains. They might notice tall, scraggly herbs with serrated leaves and tough stalks. Perhaps they collect the fibrous stems to twist into rope, or gather oily seeds to eat for nourishment. These simple uses would mark the beginning of humanity's bond with cannabis, a bond that would only deepen over the centuries. Indeed, archaeological evidence suggests that cannabis was among the very first plants that humans cultivated. In East Asia, hemp fibers and seeds have been found at sites dating back to the Neolithic Age, the New Stone Age, when agriculture began. On a small Japanese island, for example, researchers discovered ancient cannabis achenes, seeds, in layers of soil from around 8000 BC, indicating that people were already using the plant by then. Impressions of hemp rope appear on Chinese pottery fragments from the 5th millennium BC, preserved by time to tell us that early villagers were weaving or netting with cannabis fiber. In Taiwan, too, traces of hemp cultivation about 3,000 years ago show up in the archaeological record. All these little clues whisper that hemp, the non-intoxicating form of cannabis, was a trusted material for our ancestors' daily needs. Long before anyone wrote about cannabis, people were planting and harvesting it, finding it useful and perhaps even a bit magical. By the 3rd millennium BC, approximately 5,000 years ago, cannabis stepped into recorded history. In ancient China, legends speak of the herbalist emperor Shen Nung, around 2700 BC, who taught the value of medicinal plants. Shen Nung is said to have included hemp, in his materia medica, prescribing it for ailments like pain and gout. Whether this exact figure existed or not, early Chinese texts do mention cannabis as a medicine. The plant's stalks provided fiber for cloth and paper. Its seeds were pressed for oil and eaten, and its leaves and resin were recognized for soothing certain illnesses. We can imagine a wise Chinese healer in a quiet village, grinding cannabis into a paste to apply to a patient's aching joints, or brewing a mild cannabis tea to relieve malaria and female troubles. As was later recorded, the tone in those ancient apothecaries would have been calm and purposeful, using nature's gifts to ease human suffering, much as people today seek comfort in a warm cup of herbal tea. Meanwhile, far to the west and south, in the broad steppes of Central Asia and the Indian subcontinent, other cultures were discovering different aspects of this plant. In ancient India, cannabis found a sacred home. The earliest Hindu scriptures, the Vedas, dating back well over 3,000 years, include hymns to sacred plants and substances. One celebrated elixir is called soma. Its true identity remains a mystery, but some scholars have wondered if soma might have been a preparation of cannabis or a mix of psychoactive herbs. Whether or not cannabis was soma, it certainly appears in later Indian tradition. The plant came to be known as ganja or banga in Sanskrit, and it was associated with the god Shiva, who, according to legend, enjoyed the herb in the form of bhang, a cannabis-infused drink. One can easily picture a scene at a bustling ancient Indian festival. perhaps the springtime holy celebration, where devotees, after a day of throwing coloured powders, retire to sip a creamy, spiced pang lassi. The drink, made from ground cannabis leaves, milk, and spices, is taken in honor of Shiva. As the sun sets, the crowd grows mellow and contemplative, the day's excitement giving way to a soft tranquility. In the past, warm night air, an old sadhu, holy man, smiles to himself, believing that this green plant is a gift of the gods, meant to bring humans closer to the divine. For thousands of years, such ritual and spiritual use of cannabis has been a part of Indian culture, always in a gentle, reverent manner, a sacrament to deepen meditation or celebrate life's moments. From India and China to the wide plains of Central Asia, cannabis also played a role in early shamanic rituals and daily life. Nomadic peoples of the steppe, horse-riding tribes who roamed the grasslands north of the Black Sea and east toward Siberia, knew the cannabis plant very well. These were the Scythians and related cultures, fierce and freedom-loving, but also fond of feasting and ceremony. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, gives us a vivid and surprising account of a Scythian funeral rite. After the solemn burial of their dead, Herodotus says, the Scythians would purify themselves by entering a small tent and throwing hemp seeds onto hot stones. The seeds would smolder and fill the tent with dense, pungent smoke, causing the mourners to howl with joy in an ecstatic, drifting state. To the Greeks, who preferred water and soap for bathing, this smoke bath ritual seemed barbaric and strange, but to the Scythians, it was a cherished release, a way to cleanse the spirit, and perhaps to send off the departed soul with sacred smoke. Archaeology supports Herodotus's tale. In the Altai Mountains and other parts of Central Asia, Kurgan's ancient barrow tombs have yielded braziers, charred hemp seeds, and even cannabis residues on wooden burners, indicating that mourners indeed burned cannabis in remembrance of the dead. In one high mountain cemetery at Jiuzhankal, western China, about 2,500 years old, scientists found burnt stones and wooden bowls, still containing traces of high THC cannabis. The people there had selected potent wild cannabis and inhaled its smoke, likely as part of a funeral ritual to commune with the spirit world. Think of that ancient ceremony for a moment. A circle of nomads gathers inside a tent on a cold night, their faces lit by the glow of heated stones. A handful of dried cannabis is thrown onto the stones, and as a thick, resinous smoke rises, the air becomes hazy. Flute-like music begins to play, perhaps a simple melody on a horsehead, fiddle, or drum, and the participants breathe deeply. They feel a lightness, a softening of grief's sharp edges. Someone begins to laugh or chant quietly, not out of disrespect, but from a sudden euphoria that washes over the group. In that compassionate haze, they may believe they are touching the realm of spirits, saying goodbye to their lost friend in a language beyond words. The cannabis smoke, far from being a party drug, is here a sacred bridge between the living and the dead, used with solemn intention. As the night wears on, the smoke thins, and the mourners emerge from the tent calmer, purified by their hotbox ritual, the first in recorded history. Beyond its ceremonial role, cannabis in these ancient times was also a practical crop. Central Asian groups likely grew it for its hemp fiber to make clothes and rope, and they knew its seeds as a nutritious food. The climate of the steppes and foothills is dry and harsh, but cannabis is a hardy plant. It even produces its own sticky resin as a protection against the sun and heat. the very resin that contains its mind-altering properties. So we see that nature, environment, and human need all conspired to make cannabis one of the earliest domesticated plants. Whether as a mundane fiber or a mystical smoke, the herb had secured a small but significant place in human life by the end of the ancient period. As we breathe in the depth of time, we can sense that by 2000–1000 BC, many cultures from East Asia to South Asia to the Eurasian steppes were already acquainted with cannabis in one form or another. In this ancient origins chapter of our journey, the use of cannabis remains largely benign and integrated into daily life. It was another plant among many, useful, occasionally special, but not yet a source of great controversy. People wove their clothes from its fibers without any fuss. They added its seeds to their porridge. They noticed that certain preparations of the plant could ease pain or induce a gentle drowsiness. And in a few contexts, they discovered that smoke from the flowers or resin could affect the mind and mood, a discovery that would slowly spread and be interpreted through the lens of each culture's beliefs. Now, as night deepens in our imaginary voyage, let's gently float toward the cradle of civilization, the ancient Middle East and Egypt. In those lands of pyramids and palm groves, ziggurats and desert winds, what role did cannabis play? Did the pharaohs and prophets know the secrets of the hemp plant? We move forward in time, keeping our slow and drowsy pace, to explore the evidence and stories from these early civilizations. Close your eyes if you like, and picture a caravan crossing the dunes, or an incense burner releasing perfumed smoke in a temple. The tale of cannabis continues, softly, into the realms of pharaohs and kings. Ancient Middle East and Egypt, herbs of the gods and pharaohs. Our journey brings us to the lands of the Middle East and North Africa, where some of humanity's oldest civilizations blossomed along great rivers: the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates. In these desert and oasis realms, the use of plants for ritual and healing was a highly developed art. It is here that cannabis, too, left subtle traces in the historical record. While not as prominent as in India or China, the plant was known and used in various ways. We must tread carefully and quietly, as if entering a dimly lit hall of ancient inscriptions, to piece together how the peoples of Mesopotamia, the Levant, and Egypt regarded this herb. In the ancient Mesopotamian world, the region of modern-day Iraq, Syria, and surrounding areas, we find one of the earliest written references to cannabis. The Assyrians, fierce and scholarly in equal measure, knew a plant they called kunubu, or kunabu. This word appears in cuneiform tablets and seems to refer to a resinous plant used as an incense or medicine. Linguistic historians suggest that kunubu might be the root of the word cannabis itself. How fascinating to think that the very name by which we know this plant may have traveled from ancient Akkadian or Old Persian tongues into Greek and then Latin. To the Assyrians, kunubu was likely burned to produce a fragrant smoke. The term has been interpreted as meaning the way to produce smoke, hinting at fumigation rituals. We can imagine an Assyrian temple around 800 BC. A priest stands before a carved altar, perhaps dedicated to Ishtar or another deity, and he tosses a mixture of aromatic herbs onto a charcoal brazier. A thin ribbon of smoke rises, carrying prayers to the heavens. In that mix, among frankincense and myrrh, could be a bit of kunubu, cannabis resin, adding its particular sweet, woody scent to the holy atmosphere. The effect might have been subtle, a mild euphoria or a heightened sense of reverence among worshippers as they inhaled the sacred smoke. In the hush of the ziggurat's inner sanctum, this aromatic cloud would be part of the mystical experience of communion with the divine. Traveling west to the ancient land of Israel and Judah, we find another intriguing hint of cannabis use, one uncovered only recently. At an archaeological site in Tel Arad, in modern Israel, scientists discovered residues of cannabis on altars dating to the 8th century BC. This was the time of the Hebrew kings and prophets, a time when the Bible's oldest texts were being written. The altars at Tel Arad were likely used for burning incense offerings. The surprise came when chemical analysis showed traces of cannabis mixed with other substances on one altar. It appears that cannabis resin, perhaps mixed with oils or herbs, was used as part of ritual worship in this outpost shrine of Judah. Such a practice might not have been mainstream. In fact, the presence of cannabis could have been viewed as unorthodox or even heretical by strict followers of the Israelite religion, which emphasized offerings of frankincense and forbade intoxicants for priests on duty. Some scholars speculate that this shrine was eventually closed, possibly under King Hezekiah's reforms, which aimed to centralize worship and eliminate local cultic practices. But for us, lying here listening to the story, it opens a gentle, provocative image that even in the biblical era, a whiff of cannabis smoke might have mingled with prayers under the desert sky. Picture a small stone altar glowing with embers at dusk, a robed attendant adding a pinch of sticky resin. The smoke curls upward in the golden evening light as a psalm is chanted. For a moment, priest and supplicants alike might feel a softened consciousness, a touch of calm that eases the boundary between earth and heaven. It's a poetic possibility, cannabis as one of the spices of the ancient Holy Land's devotion. Now, let us sail down the Nile into the world of ancient Egypt, a civilization as old as time, where art and medicine were entwined with everyday life. Did the Egyptians know of cannabis? The answer appears to be yes, though for them it was likely not a dramatic psychoactive substance, but rather one of many useful plants. The ancient Egyptian word shemshemet has been identified by some historians as referring to cannabis. In tomb paintings and writings, the Egyptians recorded extensive uses of herbs for treating ailments, and cannabis seems to have been among these remedies. According to later reviews by Egyptologists, shemshemet, hemp, was listed in medical papyri for things like treating sore eyes, inflammation, and even as part of an obstetric aid to cool the uterus and ease childbirth pain. One recipe from around 1500 BC in the Ebers Papyrus describes a preparation to be applied vaginally to reduce pain. Modern analysts believe it likely contained cannabis as an anti-inflammatory agent. Similarly, other prescriptions suggest using hemp seeds or oil to bandage swollen fingers or toes, and as suppositories for hemorrhoids. These applications sound very down-to-earth and practical. If we step into an Egyptian healer's workshop, maybe around 1200 BC, we'd see baskets of herbs, coriander, mandrake, willow bark, and yes, perhaps a bundle of dried hemp. The healer, skilled in the lore of plants, might grind the hemp into a paste with honey and apply it as a poultice. There is no fanfare or mystery here, just the quiet confidence of ancient medicine, using what the gods have provided to ease human ills. Beyond medicine, the Egyptians certainly valued hemp fibers too. They made ropes and textiles from flax primarily, but hemp would have been a welcome supplement. It's recorded that, by the time of the later pharaohs, even into the Ptolemaic period, the use of cannabis was known. In fact, a noteworthy detail: the Roman Emperor Aurelian in the 3rd century AD imposed a tax on Egyptian cannabis, which implies it was cultivated and traded on some scale as a valuable crop. We also have hints in Egyptian iconography. For instance, the goddess Seshat, patron of writing and wisdom, is often depicted with a 7-pointed leaf emblem above her head. Some researchers interpret that symbol as a stylized hemp leaf, a subtle reference to Shemshemet and its importance in record keeping, or perhaps in the pursuit of knowledge. Whether that interpretation is certain or not, it's a lovely thought. A deity of knowledge crowned with a cannabis leaf, as if acknowledging that this plant, too, had a role in the civilization's intellectual and spiritual life. Now, imagine wandering through an Egyptian marketplace in the late period, say around 500 BC. The air is warm and filled with the calls of merchants. Among sacks of grain and spices, you come across a vendor selling fibers and ropes. Coils of hemp rope lie next to linen cloth. Another vendor has jars of fragrant oil and medicinal salves. One jar might contain a greenish balm labeled for easing pain, likely made with local herbs including cannabis. In a quiet corner, an old woman is preparing a mixture to smoke in a pipe. But wait, did Egyptians smoke cannabis? The evidence here is scant for pharaonic times. Smoking as a practice, with pipes, didn't really take hold until much later, after tobacco's introduction. Instead, any psychoactive use of cannabis in ancient Egypt probably came through tinctures, teas, or burning incense. However, interestingly, scientific tests on some mummies, like the famous pharaoh Ramses II, have reportedly found traces of THC and other cannabis markers in the body tissues. This suggests that toward the end of their life, or post-mortem, some Egyptians were exposed to cannabis, perhaps as part of medicinal treatment or the mummification process. It's a gentle image to consider: an aging pharaoh or noble given a calming potion laced with cannabis to ease pain in their final days, or aromatic herbs used in embalming that included cannabis to sanctify the body. If you listen to the desert wind and the distant cry of an ibis, you might sense that in these ancient Middle Eastern and North African cultures, cannabis was a quiet presence. It was not the star of the show, but it played supporting roles. A bit of incense here, a thread in a rope there, a healing balm when needed. The attitude toward it was pragmatic and integrated, and yet, as we've seen, in certain moments it crept into the sacred sphere, whether in an Assyrian ritual or at a Hebrew shrine. In Egypt, it was just another piece of the vast natural pharmacy along the Nile. No grand prohibitions or celebrations of cannabis are recorded from this era. It was simply accepted as one of many plants in the garden of civilization. Before we grow too sleepy in the languid Nile breezes, let us gently move on. Next, we will venture into the world of the Greeks and Romans, those classical civilizations that documented so much of what they knew. How did they regard this plant? What did cannabis mean to Aristotle's contemporaries or Caesar's legions? We continue our relaxed journey, the sands of time slipping quietly beneath us, as we follow cannabis into the classical Mediterranean world. The Greco-Roman world, hemp, in the classical age. Now we drift into the classical age of Greece and Rome, with its marble columns and olive groves, its philosophers and physicians. In this part of our story, cannabis appears in a somewhat different light. For the Greeks and Romans, the plant was known mostly as an agricultural crop, hemp for fiber, and less as a drug or mystical sacrament. There is a kind of quiet irony here. These cultures, which gave us Dionysian wine cults and the worship of various mind-altering substances, did not particularly embrace cannabis for getting high. Instead, they saw it as a useful plant and a minor medicine. So let us stroll through a sunlit ancient marketplace or a tidy Roman farm and observe cannabis in the classical context. The Greek word for cannabis was cannabis, the origin of our modern term. Early mentions of it can be found in texts by Herodotus, as we noted, describing the Scythians, and later by botanists and physicians like Theophrastus, Dioscorides, and Galen. These writers provide clues to how the plant was used. By and large, the Greeks and Romans valued hemp primarily for its strong fibers. Hemp ropes and sailcloth were vital to their economies. One reason being that these seafaring peoples needed durable rigging and sails for their ships. In fact, centuries later, the word canvas for sailcloth comes from cannabis, since hemp was so commonly used to make heavy fabric. We can imagine a busy harbour in ancient Greece, the masts of triremes creaking as sailors tighten ropes woven from pale hemp fibres. The smell of tar and sea salt mixes with the grassy scent of new rope. Many a Greek ship likely carried hemp cordage that originated from cannabis plants grown in Thrace or Anatolia. Even on land, farmers would braid hemp into halters for their oxen or nets for fishing. In this very practical way, cannabis was deeply embedded in the classical world's infrastructure, though quietly, much like flax or cotton, it was just another source of yarn and textiles. When it comes to medicinal writings, classical authors do note some properties of cannabis. Dioscorides, a Greek physician in the Roman army, 1st century AD, wrote a famous pharmacological text, De Materia Medica. In it, he describes cannabis and mentions that its seeds, when eaten in quantity, can dull sexual potency and make one sterile, a belief held at the time. He also notes that the juice from fresh hemp leaves could be applied to reduce inflammation or ear pain. Galen, the great Roman physician of the 2nd century AD, echoed some of these points. He recorded that hemp seeds were often consumed as a dessert in his time, candied or roasted with honey at banquets. Why? Not primarily to get intoxicated, but because they were thought to warm the body, according to the ancient medical concept of internal balance, and also to stimulate a hearty appetite for wine. In other words, guests would nibble on sweet cannabis seed confections to get thirsty and abound, cheerful, ready to drink and converse more. A mild party trick of the Roman dining table. Galen does comment that eating too many could cause a feeling of warmth in the head and a kind of light intoxication, but this was considered an occasional side effect rather than the main goal. From these accounts, we get a picture of cannabis use that is more culinary and medicinal than spiritual in the classical world. One delightful image comes to mind. Imagine a Roman banquet on a summer evening in a villa garden. After the multi-course feast, slaves bring out a tray of small cakes or candies. These are made with nuts, sesame, honey, and perhaps some toasted hemp seeds sprinkled in. The guests recline on their couches, pleasantly full, and pop a few of these confections in their mouths. The hemp seeds, rich in oils, produce a gentle warming sensation as described by Galen. Laughter bubbles up more easily. Maybe someone starts singing a little more freely. It's all very subdued and civilized. There are no reports of ancient Greeks or Romans rolling joints or seeking visions through cannabis. They had other substances and practices for ecstasy, like the famous wine of Dionysus or the mysteries of Delphi. For hemp, they mostly reserved the roles of rope maker, remedy for aches, and occasional amuse-bouche. Let's not forget, too, the simplest use, food. Hemp seeds are highly nutritious, containing protein and beneficial oils. In times when every resource was utilized, these seeds did not go to waste. We have a fragment from a Greek comic playwright, Ephippus, around the 4th century BC that lists delicacies for a fancy meal. Amidst fruits and cakes, he casually includes hemp seeds as a crunchy treat. It's a little detail that reveals how normalized and unremarkable cannabis was as a plant in daily life. If you lived in Athens or Rome, you might have worn hemp sandals, written on hemp-derived paper. Early forms of paper in China were hemp, though papyrus was more common in the Mediterranean, and you might have munched on hemp seeds without any thought that this plant could alter consciousness. However, there is one corner of classical use that might have edged toward the psychoactive. Some groups outside the Greco-Roman mainstream did experiment with burning or inhaling cannabis. For instance, the Thracians and Dacians, in what is now the Balkans, had shamans known as kapnobatai, meaning those who walk on smoke, clouds. According to later sources, these shamans burned cannabis flowers to induce trances. The Greeks knew of these practices at their periphery. Herodotus mentioned Thracians throwing cannabis on a fire during rituals as well. But within Rome and Greece proper, such use never caught on widely. It might have been seen as too foreign or simply unnecessary given their cultural context. Another fascinating find in recent times, in the ruins of Pompeii, the Roman city buried by Vesuvius in 79 AD, archaeologists uncovered remains of hemp fibers and seeds, indicating that the shops and households of Pompeii had hemp in stock, likely for rope and medicine. There's also some evidence that cannabis could have been an ingredient in Roman medicinal wines or balms for earaches and stomach relief. Recipes survive that mention an herb called gelotophilis, laughter-inducing leaf, which some think might be cannabis or a related psychoactive plant. But these are speculative identifications. What stands clear is that cannabis was not a major drug of choice in classical antiquity, in the way that, say, opium was. The Greeks and Romans did use opium poppy heavily for pain and as a narcotic. Cannabis was simply one minor tool in their toolkit. So, in summary, our time among the marble columns has shown us a rather modest role for cannabis. The plant was present and valued, but in a grounded, everyday manner. A Greek housewife might appreciate the hemp threads in her weaving basket. A doctor might recommend a poultice of hemp leaves for an infected sore. A sailor would trust the hemp ropes holding up the mast of his trireme. And at a convivial gathering, roasted hemp seeds might be passed around for a little extra cheer. There were no grand cults or fierce prohibitions around cannabis here. It was perhaps one of the reasons it wasn't notorious in the ancient world. It flew under the radar as a helpful but unremarkable plant. Picture now, if you will, a gentle Mediterranean afternoon, perhaps in Tuscany or on a Greek island. The cicadas are buzzing. In a courtyard shaded by grapevines, a family is working quietly. A grandmother shelling hemp seeds to mix into bread. A boy twisting hemp fibers to help his father repair a fishing net. The scene is simple and drowsy. Cannabis is there, woven into their lives as subtly as the faint scent of wild herbs in the air. With that calm classical interlude, let us continue onward. History is moving us forward, and so too is the spread of cannabis. As the classical era waned and new peoples migrated and traded, cannabis found itself on the move again, especially southward into Africa and westward across oceans to new continents. Our next stop is not a single empire or era, but rather a look at indigenous traditions in Africa and the Americas, where cannabis took root in unique ways. We'll explore how this plant was adopted far from its original home, becoming part of local cultures, and later, subject to new forms of reverence and restriction. Keep your mind quiet and open as we now traverse new terrains under the guiding star of our gentle narrative. Indigenous traditions in Africa and the Americas. Our voyage now carries us to Africa and the Americas, where cannabis arrived as a traveler and sometimes an invader, long after it had been familiar to Asia and Europe. These vast lands each have their own rich tapestry of indigenous plants and rituals. Cannabis was not originally native to the Americas, and in much of sub-Saharan Africa it was a newcomer as well. But people in these regions found uses for it and wove it into their cultural practices in remarkable ways. Let's continue with our slow, dreamy exploration, stepping into village scenes under the tropical sun, or wandering through highland trails with traders carrying their precious herbs. Africa, from sacred smoke to colonial dagga, cannabis is not indigenous to Africa. Its true origins lie in Central South Asia. Yet, Africa has a very long history with the plant, likely dating back to the 13th century or earlier, when it was introduced by trade. Imagine Arab merchants and Indian travelers journeying along the East African coast in the late Middle Ages, their dhows laden with spices, silks, and perhaps sacks of dried cannabis or seeds. As these traders interacted with local populations, cannabis, known by various names such as pang or dagga, began to spread inland. By oral tradition, some say it was the Bantu migrations that carried cannabis from the East African coast southward into the interior. However it happened, by the time European explorers reached sub-Saharan Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries, they found that many African communities were already growing and using cannabis. Let's picture a scene in East Africa, perhaps around the 1400s. In a highland village, maybe in what is now Ethiopia or Kenya, a healer tends to a clay pipe filled with a mixture of herbs. Earlier, she harvested some wild-looking plants from a nearby patch. These plants were cannabis, likely introduced generations ago and now thriving in the climate. As the evening chill sets in, she lights the pipe and inhales, blowing the smoke around a patient in a cleansing ritual. In these regions, cannabis took on spiritual and medicinal roles. For example, among certain groups in Ethiopia, there is early evidence that by the 1330–1430 century, people were already smoking cannabis from water pipe bowls. Archaeologists have found 700-year-old pipes with cannabis residue in Ethiopia. This suggests that well before tobacco, which came from the Americas later on, Africans in some areas had innovated ways to smoke cannabis, using pipes or chillums, likely as part of spiritual ceremonies or healing practices. As cannabis spread through Central and Southern Africa, different ethnic groups adopted it in their finest, own ways. Many African names for cannabis reflect affection and familiarity. For instance, dagga in South Africa, mbanja in parts of East, Southern Africa, pang from Indian influence in the Swahili coast, and other local terms like motokwane, nsangu, etc. The plant often became linked to shamanism and rites of passage. Among the Khoisan of the Cape region, it's said that shamans used dagga to enter trance states. The Zulu people, renowned warriors of southern Africa, were reported to use cannabis before battle to enhance courage and focus. One can imagine Zulu warriors in the early 1800s sitting around a small fire at dawn, passing a hornpipe packed with dagga, each taking a slow draw. The smoke rises as the first light of day touches their shields. They believe this act gives them clarity and bravery, bonding them as they prepare for combat, a calm unity before the storm of conflict. Whether the dagger actually had significant effects on their martial prowess or it was largely symbolic, it became part of the warrior tradition, as noted in later accounts. In more peaceful settings, cannabis in Africa was used socially and medicinally. Among various communities, like in the Congo Basin, Nigeria, Malawi, and others, elders might smoke a pipe in the evenings to relax and tell stories. Communal gatherings could involve sharing cannabis in a circle, fostering dialogue and community spirit. In what is now Zimbabwe, for instance, historical anecdotes mention people brewing cannabis into teas or simply smoking it during communal meetings, treating it almost like one would treat a mild home-brewed beer, something to bring people together in harmony. For medicine, African healers incorporated cannabis to treat ailments such as malaria, fever, asthma, and pain. The Basotho people of Lesotho, a highland region, use cannabis to help women in childbirth, easing labor pains. Visualize a rondavel hut in Lesotho, maybe in the 1700s. A woman in labor is surrounded by midwives. Outside, a fire is lit and cannabis leaves are thrown on it, wafting soothing smoke inside. The mother breathes it in, calmed by its presence, while a special cannabis-infused brew is given to her in sips to dull the pain. Such was the gentle, practical use of the plant, a midwife's aid, a nighttime comfort, a social bond in the village. By the time European colonists arrived in full force, 19th century, cannabis was well embedded in many African societies. Some early European accounts actually marveled at or mocked the local use of dagga, but soon colonial authorities grew concerned. They often associated cannabis use with the groups they ruled, sometimes stereotyping it as a cause of laziness or indiscipline among workers, much as they did with opium in Asia. This led to some of the earliest prohibitions on cannabis anywhere in the world, right there in colonial Africa. For instance, the British in Mauritius, an Indian Ocean, banned Indian laborers from using ganja as early as 1840. In South Africa's British colony Natal, the law of 1870 explicitly forbade Indian indentured servants from smoking or possessing hemp, reflecting the colonists' fear that it would undermine labor efficiency. Despite these edicts, cannabis use persisted covertly among the local populations. In fact, by the late 19th century, European observers noted that in places like the Congo, Malawi, and Nigeria, cannabis cultivation was widespread, supplying both local use and regional trade. It became an underground crop in some areas due to colonial disapproval, but it never disappeared. The rhythms of rural life often continued, unchanged. A farmer might tend to a hidden patch of nsangu, cannabis, behind his cornfield, knowing it was a reliable medicinal and cash crop, even if the colonial police frowned on it. So, in Africa, cannabis traveled from being an introduced curiosity to a beloved local custom, and then to a target of colonial crackdown, all over the span of a few centuries. The plant earned nicknames like the smoke of the ancestors in some cultures, indicating its spiritual significance, and simultaneously got labeled as insidious by foreign rulers who didn't understand its context. Through it all, ordinary people in Africa continued to quietly light their pipes at day's end or administer their herbal remedies, much as their forebears had done. Now, with our senses filled with the earthy scents of African savannas and the soft crackle of pipe embers in the night, let us traverse the oceans to a new world entirely, the Americas. The Americas, new lands, new contexts. Cannabis was unknown in the Americas until the age of exploration. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had their own sacred plants, tobacco, coca, peyote, and many others. But cannabis was absent until it was brought by Europeans and Africans across the Atlantic. So, the story here is one of introduction and adaptation. Cannabis arrived in the New World as a crop for fiber and as a folk intoxicant via enslaved peoples and immigrants, and it gradually took on roles in the Americas that ranged from plantation staple to the bane of lawmakers. In this portion of our journey, we maintain a calm tone, observing how a plant new to the hemisphere slowly became part of its cultural and political landscape. The first appearance of cannabis in the Americas likely came in the 16th century. Spanish conquistadors and settlers, noting the value of hemp for rope and sails, attempted to grow it in colonies where the climate allowed. Historical records show that by 1545, the Spanish were cultivating hemp in Chile. This might have been the very first hemp farm in the Americas. Picture a Spanish colonial outpost in Chile's Central Valley. A friar or official oversees indigenous laborers planting hemp seeds imported from Europe. The sun is hot, but the plants thrive in the rich soil. Within a few months, tall hemp stalks sway in the breeze. These will be retted and turned into fibers to support the Spanish naval enterprise in the Pacific. There is little notion of drug use here. It's purely agricultural. Similarly, in the English colonies on the North American East Coast, hemp was strongly encouraged. The Jamestown colony in Virginia by 1619 had laws requiring colonists to devote a portion of their land to hemp cultivation. Hemp was as strategic a resource as timber or tar. The English Navy needed ropes and canvas, and the New World could supply them. Early travelers, like Gabriel Archer, even noted seeing the local Native American tribes in the Virginia area growing hemp in their villages by 1607. This is an interesting note. It's possible the native Powhatan people had begun cultivating hemp that either grew wild or was introduced by Europeans, showing how quickly a useful plant can be adopted. There was also wild cannabis sativa, noted along rivers like the Potomac by the early 1600s. Whether truly indigenous, perhaps not, or naturalized from earlier introductions, hemp was making itself at home in American soil. It wasn't just the colonizers who brought cannabis. In many cases, it was the enslaved Africans, enslaved people from parts of Africa where cannabis use was common, like Angola, the Congo region, or Madagascar, were taken to Brazil, the Caribbean, and the American South. They sometimes carried with them seeds or simply the knowledge of the plant. In Brazil, there's a strong suggestion that cannabis, known as maconha, there was introduced in the 1800s, or possibly earlier, by West African slaves who had used it in their homeland. Some accounts even describe slave owners encouraging slaves to grow and smoke cannabis as a means to keep them pacified. A dark, unsettling piece of history, if true. For instance, in 19th century northeast Brazil, plantation owners allowed slaves small plots where they planted maconha for personal use, believing it made them more complacent after the grueling day's work. In any case, by the early 1800s, Cannabis had taken root in Brazil to the extent that the municipal government of Rio de Janeiro outlawed its use by slaves in 1830, fearful of its influence. This is one of the earliest drug laws in the Americas, a quiet foreshadowing of the much broader prohibitions to come. One can imagine a warm evening in Bahia in the 1820 seconds. A group of enslaved Africans gather in a furtive circle, passing a pipe of maconha leaves around a small fire, singing softly in their mother tongue, a brief respite and remembrance of their distant homes. The plantation overseers frown upon it, perhaps, but in that moment, the slaves reclaim a shred of freedom in their communal smoke, a balm for the soul under the tropical night. Moving north, cannabis also found its way into Mexico and the Caribbean. Spanish traders and later Indian laborers introduced it to places like Jamaica, Trinidad, and Mexico. In Mexico, it became known as marijuana, later spelled marijuana, with early use recorded among indigenous and mestizo peasants in the 19th century for folk remedies and recreation. Mexican culture had a mix of attitudes. On one hand, marijuana was used by curanderos, healers, as an infusion to treat things like pain or insomnia. On the other hand, by the late 1800s, it gained a bit of notoriety as a substance associated with lower-class outcasts or soldiers. There's a fragment of a popular revolutionary folk song, La Cucaracha, that humorously references a character who can't walk anymore because he has no marijuana to smoke. This line likely emerged around the time of the Mexican Revolution, 1910 seconds, showing that cannabis smoking had become a noted phenomenon among some groups, possibly soldiers or camp followers, often looked at with a mix of amusement and disapproval. Still, in the villages, a grandmother might pick wild Pipiltzintzintles, a local name that may have referred to cannabis among other herbs, and brew a calming tea for her grandson's cough, never imagining the storms of controversy that would swirl around this plant in the decades to come. In the Caribbean, notably Jamaica, cannabis arrived mainly through the Indian indentured servants who were brought by the British after emancipation of slaves, mid-1800s. These Indians carried with them the tradition of ganja. By the early 20th century, ganja smoking was common among the poor in Jamaica, and it took on a spiritual dimension with the rise of the Rastafari movement in the 1930 seconds. Though our timeline will cover Rastafarians more in the 20th century section, it's worth mentioning here as part of indigenous cultural adoption. Rastafarians embraced cannabis as a holy sacrament, calling it the holy herb or wisdom weed, using it in grounding religious ceremonies to aid in meditation, communal reasoning, and to get closer to Jah, God. Envision a peaceful hillside in rural Jamaica around the 1940 seconds. A small group of dreadlocked Rastas sit beneath a cotton tree, a chill breeze rustling the leaves. They light a chalice, a type of communal pipe, packed with pungent ganja. As they inhale deeply, they begin a low chant, or perhaps a discussion of scripture. The smoke wafts upward, and in their minds it carries prayers for freedom and divine guidance. Though authorities frown on this illicit gathering, within that circle, there is unity, upliftment, and a profound sense of calm. The herb to them is a gift, a means to see through Babylon's illusions and find truth. It's striking how a plant once just a fiber source in colonial fields became a pillar of a new spiritual identity in the Americas. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, then, Cannabis in the Americas lived a double life. On plantations and farms, it was cultivated for respectable uses: rope, sales, medicine, while among the enslaved, the indentured, and the poor, it quietly served as a source of relief, cultural memory, and sometimes rebellion. Importantly, this was all relatively low profile. Cannabis had not yet become a major public concern. People in power barely took note of it, aside from occasional local bans like Rio's 1830 law. The general population was more familiar with other stimulants or intoxicants. Alcohol reigned supreme. Tobacco was ubiquitous. Opium lurked in patent medicines. Cannabis was a minor chord in the symphony of substances, known but not loudly proclaimed. As we end this segment on Africa and the Americas, let's gather a serene composite image. It is evening in a little village. It could be anywhere. The highlands of Lesotho, the banks of the Mississippi, where a slave quarters lies, or a hut in the Andes, where some hemp was experimentally sown. The sky is deep indigo. A few people are gathered around a small fire, passing a pipe or sharing a makeshift cigarette of cannabis. Their faces are lit by the glow, and they are quiet, maybe humming a lullaby or just listening to the night insects. The troubles of the day recede with each gentle puff of smoke. Different languages, different songs, but a similar sense of comfort and community is found in that simple act. Cannabis in these indigenous traditions is about solace and solidarity, a plant that, despite being new to their shores, found a place in the age-old human quest for relief from pain and momentary peace of mind. Our eyes grow heavy with the smoke and stories. We have traversed continents and centuries now. The journey continues, and next, we will enter a period of history where cannabis's fate takes dramatic turns, an era of golden ages and dark prohibitions. But before the upheavals of modernity, there was a vibrant chapter in the medieval period that we've hinted at, the world of Islamic culture during its golden age. It is there that cannabis, in the form of hashish, truly blossomed as a subject of literature, joy, and eventual suppression. Let us slowly pivot to that rich chapter, keeping our tone tranquil and our pace unhurried. The Islamic Golden Age, hashish, mystics, and sultans. As the classical world gave way to the medieval, a new cultural and religious force spread across the old world: Islam. From the 7th century onward, Islamic civilization grew from Arabia to span the Middle East, North Africa, and beyond, ushering in a golden age of science, art, and literature between roughly the 8th and 13th centuries. It is within this milieu that cannabis took on a new life, particularly in its concentrated form known as hashish, cannabis resin. The story of cannabis in the Islamic world is a tale of mystical devotion, popular recreation, and periodic crackdowns. It is colorful, yet also contemplative, full of poetic imagery that suits our meditative journey well. Islamic teachings famously prohibit alcohol as haram, forbidden, which left an intriguing opening. Substances not mentioned explicitly in the Quran, like cannabis, occupied a gray area. Early on, Muslim physicians recognized cannabis's medicinal properties, but it was likely the Sufi mystics who embraced hashish for spiritual purposes. A popular legend attributes the discovery of hashish's delights to a Persian Sufi master named Sheikh Haydar in the 12th century AD. The legend, though likely apocryphal, is enchanting. Haydar, an ascetic monk, lived reclusively in the mountains of Khorasan. One scorching summer day, overcome by melancholy, he wandered outside his monastery. He noticed some wild cannabis plants, dancing in the heat, swaying when all other plants drooped. Curious, he plucked and ate a few leaves. Before long, the monk felt an unexpected euphoria and lightness of spirit. When he returned to his disciples, they were astonished to find their formerly austere master now smiling, eyes twinkling with mirth. He even invited them into his private quarters, something he never did, and shared laughter with them. The disciples begged to know the cause of his change. Haydar at first was reluctant to reveal the secret plant, but eventually he led them to the cannabis patch on the hillside, making them swear to keep it within the Sufi brotherhood. From that day on, according to the tale, the Sufis adopted hashish as the poor man's wine, a means to achieve spiritual bliss and forget the harshness of the world. Haydar, who lived 10 more years, allegedly sustained by cannabis leaves, even requested that hemp grow on his tomb so his soul could forever walk in its shade. Whether or not this story has a kernel of truth, it captures a gentle essence. For many Sufis, hashish was a tool for ecstasy and meditation. It was said to help them concentrate on the divine by quieting worldly concerns, somewhat akin to how some mystics elsewhere might use fasting or whirling dances. The Islamic Golden Age produced a rich literature on hashish. Poets wrote playful verses praising the herb's ability to induce dreamlike states and philosophical contemplation. One poet, consuming hashish, described seeing the world in a grain of sand and conversing with Awaris, heavenly nymphs in his imagination, all in good-natured, whimsical verse. Hashish was often consumed as an edible during this era, like in sweetmeats or drinks, especially before the widespread arrival of smoking after 1500. People would make confections like majoun, a mixture of hashish paste with honey, spices, and nuts, or simply chew resinous balls. The effects were slower, but often stronger and longer lasting than smoking, leading to more profound and sometimes disorienting experiences. Hashish was by no means confined to mystics. It filtered through all layers of society in certain regions. In Cairo, by the 1200s, hashish use had become common among the populace, especially within Sufi circles, but also among artisans and the idle rich. Travelers from Syria introduced it to Egypt around the time of the Ayyubid dynasty, 12th–13th century. Observers noted that Egyptian Sufis in the 13th century were regularly using hashish as part of their practices. Its popularity grew, and with popularity often comes the ire of authorities. The medieval Islamic chronicles tell of periods when rulers attempted to stamp out hashish. One famous case, in 1378, the Emir of Junaima, in Arabia, named Sudan Shekuni, is recorded as having outlawed cannabis entirely. He reportedly commanded that all cannabis plants in the region be destroyed, and that habitual users, particularly among Sufi mendicants, should have their teeth pulled out as punishment to prevent them from chewing the resin or leaves. Such draconian measures reflect how unnerved some leaders were by the widespread hashish phenomenon. They saw it as a social ill or a threat to religious propriety, much like the temperance movements against alcohol in other times and places. Another crackdown occurred under the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt. At various times in the 14th–15th centuries, Mamluk sultans banned the sale of hashish, even punishing users by publicly extracting their molar, teeth. Yet, these harsh measures had limited success. Hashish use went underground, only to resurface whenever enforcement waned. The plant's appeal was simply too strong for many, in an era of hard work and few comforts for the common man. A bit of hashish offered laughter, relaxation, and forgetfulness. It was said that hashish replaced the wine cup for the masses after Islam forbade alcohol. So, while wine was the chosen metaphor of ecstasy for Persian poets like Omar Khayyam, hashish became the intoxicant of the common folk and the dervishes. The cultural attitude towards hashish in the Islamic Golden Age was ambivalent. Many orthodox scholars condemned it, equating its mind-altering effects to those of wine and thus deeming it sinful. Others took a softer view, noting that the Quran doesn't explicitly ban plants like hashish and that its harms seemed less severe than alcohol. No raging drunkenness or violence, mostly just sleepy contentment or giggles. A few. Medical writers even defended moderate use for recreation, provided it didn't distract from one's duties or prayers. This debate continued for centuries, a gentle back and forth about whether the greenness, a nickname for hashish, was a blessing or a curse. One delightful literary artifact is The Tale of the Hashish Eater from the Arabian Nights, though not in all versions. In it, a poor man in Cairo eats a big chunk of hashish, imagines himself transported to a palace of luxury where beautiful women attend him, only to come back to reality finding himself half naked on the street. It's a comic cautionary story. Yet, even in the comedy, there's a sense of empathy for why someone would indulge, to escape poverty and dream of better things, even if just for a night. The tone is light-hearted, matching our own gentle narrative. We can almost hear the chuckles of those medieval storytellers as they recounted the misadventures of a hashish eater, lulling their armor audiences by the glow of lanterns. Now, think of a medieval Persian garden for a moment, a walled courtyard with fountains and roses, under a sky spangled with early evening stars. In one corner, a small group of friends gather on plush carpets. They're literati, perhaps poets or philosophers, and they've decided tonight to partake in a bit of hashish. One rolls a pellet of sticky resin, another has prepared a hookah-like water pipe. There is some debate, but water pipes may have been in use even before tobacco, possibly for hashish. The pipe is passed around, each taking a slow inhalation. At first, conversation continues normally about the newest ghazal, poem, or a point of theology. But soon, soft laughter arises. One friend gazes at the moon and remarks how it looks like a silver coin floating in dark water. Another giggles at an entirely private thought about his pet cat. They all feel a sense of ease and camaraderie deepen. The gardens of Shiraz, or Baghdad, have hosted many such scenes. Discreet, convivial sessions of indulgence beneath the cypress trees. In those moments, hashish was simply a gentle facilitator of the age-old human habit of gathering and unwinding. The Islamic Golden Age eventually waned. Mongol invasions, internal strife, and changing trade routes shifted centers of power. But hashish remained as a legacy, spreading with Islam into Turkey, Central Asia, India, and beyond. By the 15th and 16th centuries, when the Ottoman Turks and Persian Safavids held sway, hashish was part of urban life from Constantinople to Kabul, even as officialdom might scowl. Interestingly, the advent of tobacco, brought from the Americas around the 1500s, changed consumption habits. People began mixing tobacco and hashish, smoking both in pipes. This increased the practice of smoking as opposed to eating hashish in the Old World. As our narrative leaves the medieval period, we feel a transition. The world is becoming more interconnected. The age of sale is about to bring Europeans east and eastern goods west in massive exchanges. With these global shifts, cannabis, in all its forms, will play new roles. It will become a colonial commodity, an item of scientific interest, and eventually a subject of international law. The serenity of our tale will be tested by these developments. But fear not. We will maintain our calm, sleep-friendly tone, even as we recount tumultuous times. Before moving on, let's take a final reflective pause in the world of hashish. Imagine standing on a balcony in old Damascus or Delhi at dusk, perhaps around 1600. The call to prayer fades in the distance. From a nearby house, there's a faint sweet smell. Someone is baking majun pastries with hashish and honey, filling the evening with an earthy aroma. A philosopher in his study adds a bit of cannabis resin to a cup of tea, hoping it will open his mind to inspiration as he writes under the gentle flicker of an oil lamp. Down the street, a group of fakirs, holy mendicants, huddle over a pipe, passing it and humming a repetitive chant, eyes half closed as if seeing inward visions. All is calm, the night is warm, and in that corner of history, the cannabis plant is a giver of solace, insight, and sometimes mirth. Our journey through antiquity and the Middle Ages has been long and soothing. We have seen cannabis as fiber and sacrament, as medicine and muse. Now, the modern era beckons, a time of exploration, colonization, science, and eventually prohibition. Let us step gently into the 19th century, the age of empires and enlightenment, where attitudes toward cannabis would shift from exotic curiosity to something more foreboding. Keep your pillow soft and your mind open as we traverse into the age of colonial and Victorian attitudes toward this ancient herb. Colonial and Victorian attitudes, curiosity, medicine, and the first bans. The 18th and 19th centuries marked a period of colossal change worldwide. European empires expanded, colonizing vast lands in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. With them, they brought their values and also encountered new customs and substances. Cannabis, which we followed through Asia and Africa, now becomes a topic of interest and debate among these colonial powers. In this era, the tone shifts between fascination and fear. The plant is studied by scientists and enjoyed by bohemian elites, even as it starts to be regulated and restricted by colonial laws. We will recount these developments in a calm and measured way, for even in the bustle of the Victorian age, there were quiet parlours and scholarly studies where cannabis played a role. The age of exploration and early encounters. By the late 1700s, cannabis, as hemp, was already a fixture in European material life. Ropes of Italian ships, sacks and canvas of British factories, all used hemp fibre. But cannabis, as a psychoactive drug, was largely unknown, or very rare in Europe, until the 19th century. The catalyst for change was increased travel and curiosity about the Orient, a term Europeans used for the East. When Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Egypt in 1798, his French troops discovered that the locals, not having alcohol forbidden by Islam, instead partook of hashish confections and smoke. The French soldiers, bored and dry in the desert heat, tried this greenish indulgence and found it quite to their liking. It's said that many of Napoleon's men began enjoying hashish during their Egyptian campaign. They would eat hashish jam or inhale from hookahs and experience that exotic, mellow high, which made the hardships of military life temporarily fade. Alarmed by the sight of intoxicated grenadiers, giggling and lazing about, Napoleon, ever the strict general, issued an order banning his soldiers from using hashish, and even outlawed establishments that sold it. This might be one of history's first modern anti-cannabis edicts, though limited to his army. Despite the ban, many Frenchmen returned to Europe with a lingering intrigue for hashish. Following on Napoleon's heels, the early 1800s brought a wave of European scholars and adventurers studying the Orient's mysteries. One such figure was Dr. Jacques-Joseph Moreau, a French psychiatrist who traveled through North Africa and the Middle East in the 1830 seconds. Moreau became fascinated with how hashish affected the mind. On returning to Paris, he joined the famous Club des Hachishins, Club of the Hashish Eaters, around 1844. This club was a gathering of literary and intellectual luminaries, including Alexandre Dumas, Victor Hugo, and the poet Charles Baudelaire, who met in a lush hotel room adorned in Middle Eastern style. They donned oriental robes and partook of potent hashish paste, dawamesque, a blend of hashish with butter, sweeteners, and spices, served on tiny golden spoons. These sessions were half experiment, half hedonistic adventure. Members would report their experiences: euphoria, time distortion, wild visions, fits of uncontrollable laughter, or profound philosophical insight. Baudelaire later wrote Les Paradis Artificiels, Artificial Paradises, in 1860, describing the sensations of hashish and opium in poetic detail. He characterizes hashish as a way to magnify personality, sometimes blissful, sometimes terrifying if misused, but his tone is reflective, treating it as an enhancer of art and dream. The Club des Hachishins, though relatively short-lived, represents the Victorian era's curiosity and romance about cannabis. In a sleepy, candlelit Parisian parlor, brilliant minds allowed themselves to be gently unmoored by a resin from the Orient, seeking inspiration, or at least an unusual evening. Meanwhile, across the Channel in Britain, a more practical interest in cannabis was brewing. In 1839, an Irish doctor named William Brooke O'Shaughnessy, working in Calcutta for the East India Company, published a groundbreaking paper on the medical uses of cannabis. O'Shaughnessy had observed Indian traditions and tested cannabis tinctures on patients for ailments like rheumatism, cholera, and infant convulsions. The results impressed him. He reported cannabis greatly eased pain and calmed spasms in a way Western medicine had yet to achieve. He even recounted how a few drops of cannabis tincture soothed a baby's severe seizures when nothing else worked. In the meditative quiet of an Indian hospital at night, one imagines Dr. O'Shaughnessy giving a tiny dose of this green extract to a suffering patient and seeing them relax into pain-free sleep. Returning to Britain, he brought samples of Indian hemp and spurred renewed interest in the West. By the 1850 seconds, cannabis extract became a part of the British and American pharmacopoeia. Physicians prescribed it for neuralgia, migraines, insomnia, and as a general sedative. Queen Victoria's own court physician, Sir J. Russell Reynolds, wrote in 1890 that he found cannabis helpful for treating the Queen's menstrual cramps, though how much the Queen herself used it is unclear. This anecdote often surfaces as evidence of Victorian medical use. In the Victorian imagination, cannabis occupied a dual status. On one hand, an Oriental intoxicant, connected with dreamy harem scenes and mystics, exciting to artists, and on the other, a respectable pharmaceutical in a small brown bottle, dispensed by druggists to quiet a cough or induce sleep. You might find, in a well-appointed London home of the 1,870 two different scenes. In the study, the master of the house, an eccentric scholar, reads The Arabian Nights and decides to sample a bit of hashish he procured at a Parisian apothecary for the exotic thrill, and reclines to let his mind wander. Meanwhile, upstairs, his wife suffers from some ailment. The doctor has prescribed tincture of cannabis indica for her nerves. A few drops in a glass of sherry, and she feels her anxiety ebb. Her eyelids grow pleasantly heavy as a gentle calm envelops her. Both uses are happening quietly under the same roof, without much fuss or moral panic. However, the winds of change were blowing. Colonial authorities across the world started to take note of cannabis, not just as a curiosity, but as a substance used widely by their colonial subjects, sometimes to the colonizers' disapproval. We mentioned earlier how various British colonies began prohibiting cannabis in the 1800s when associated with labourers or undesirable groups. Let's look a bit closer at a few key moments. In British India, cannabis in the forms of bhang, ganja, and charas was consumed by many, from sadhus, holy ascetics, to ordinary workers. It was taxed but generally tolerated. There were occasional voices in the British administration worrying that ganja made the natives indolent or insane, but these were not based on strong evidence. To settle debates, the Government of India commissioned the Indian Hemp Drugs Commission Report, 1894. This massive study, 7 volumes long, examined usage, health effects, and social impact of cannabis in India. After exhaustive interviews and research, the Commission concluded that moderate cannabis use caused negligible harm, and even excessive use, while potentially damaging to the user, did not tend to cause violence or societal breakdown. They famously wrote that prohibition was unjustified, and that a mild indulgence in hemp was the rule, with serious abuse quite rare. Essentially, the British officials learned what traditional users had known. Used in moderation, cannabis was fairly benign, so they left it legal, with regulation and taxes. This enlightened moment stands out, as later decades would see more alarmist approaches prevail elsewhere. In contrast, Egypt under Ottoman and later British oversight took a stricter line. Hashish was popular among Egyptians, but the Khedive, viceroy of Egypt, banned importation of cannabis in 1879, marking an early national ban. Other Islamic countries, like Ottoman Turkey and Persia, also had periods of prohibition for religious reasons. In Greece, hashish smoking had caught on among the poor and in hash dens. By 1890, Greece outlawed hashish as well, trying to curb its spread. Over in the Americas, as the 19th century closed, a few places already started banning cannabis, often called by its Spanish name, marijuana. For instance, a perhaps surprising early example, Jamaica, then a British colony, made ganja illegal in 1913 due to concerns from planters about its use among Indian workers. South Africa, where British and Dutch descendants noticed the common use of dagga by African and Indian labourers, passed a law in 1922 criminalising cannabis. These early laws were often tied to racial and class prejudices. Cannabis was associated with marginalised groups, and banning it was a way to control or punish those groups under a guise of public health. In polite Victorian society, though, Cannabis did not become a big moral issue. The temperance movement targeted alcohol. Opium gained more notoriety due to addiction issues and the image of opium dens. Cannabis remained fairly niche, usually overshadowed by other drugs. For example, if one perused an 1880 issue of The Lancet, a British medical journal, you might find serious discussions on morphine and chloral hydrate abuse, but cannabis is mentioned mostly as a remedy with variable reliability. The potency of preparations varied, making some doctors frustrated when a tincture was too weak or too strong. One could purchase chlorodyne, a popular patent medicine for pain and diarrhea, which contained a cocktail of laudanum, opium, cannabis, and chloroform. Quite the potent mix. The users of these tonics probably felt a soothing wave of relief from multiple ingredients. The cannabis played a supporting role. Let's paint a gentle vignette of a Victorian evening. In a well-to-do Boston townhouse in 1885, a middle-aged gentleman sits in his library. He has indigestion and some melancholy, a not uncommon Victorian malaise. On his side table is a brown bottle labelled Extractum Cannabis Indica, 5 minims to be taken in water. He pours a small dose into a glass, dilutes it, and drinks. Over the next half hour, a sense of comfort envelops him. The cramps in his stomach ease, and a light mental relaxation sets in. He stirs the fireplace and picks up a copy of Tennyson's poems, reading quietly as the oil lamp casts a golden glow. Across the ocean, in Edinburgh, a respected doctor writes in his journal by gaslight, describing how one of his patients with persistent migraine finally found sleep thanks to a cannabis formulation. He notes how it must be used carefully. Too much can cause confusion or an unsteady gait, but in the right dose, it's a boon for rest. These scenes exemplify the low-key presence of cannabis in the 19th century. Uncontroversial, somewhat arcane, but valued by those who knew how to use it. As the 1800s turn into the 1900s, this calm status quo was about to change. The upcoming decades would see cannabis dragged into the global spotlight, not as a harmless folk drug or medicine, but as a supposed menace to society. The transformation was driven by a confluence of factors: changing social attitudes, early drug enforcement efforts, and a heap of sensationalism. We will maintain our gentle narrative, though, as we tread into the more frenetic 20th century. Even as hysteria and counterculture swirl around cannabis, we will find the quieter threads, the people who kept using it peacefully, the slow progress of scientific understanding, and ultimately, the cyclic return to acceptance. Take a deep breath. Perhaps imagine the faint smell of antique leather-bound books and a trace of sweet cannabis tincture in the air as we close the chapter on the Victorian era. The stage is set for the turbulent 20th century. Cannabis will be demonized, celebrated, outlawed, and rediscovered. Yet, even in turbulence, our story can find the calm eddies, the late-night jam sessions, the hidden garden plants, the patient relief behind closed hospital doors. Let's proceed, unhurried, into the age of prohibition and counterculture. The 20th century, prohibition, counterculture, and quiet persistence. The 20th century was a roller coaster for cannabis. It began with the substance relatively obscure in the public mind, but soon cannabis, often under the exotic name marijuana, became the subject of intense lawmaking, propaganda, and cultural symbolism. In this century, the world saw cannabis outlawed almost everywhere by mid-century. only to re-emerge as a central icon of the 1960 seconds counterculture, and then become a battleground in the war on drugs. It's a dramatic arc, but within it are also countless personal quiet moments. Someone in 1930 secretly enjoying a jazz club joint, or a 1970 seconds cancer patient finding relief with a puff. We will chronicle this era calmly, like a storyteller describing thunderstorms from a safe, warm cottage. Early 20th century, the outlawing of marijuana. As the century dawned, more and more countries piled on bans against cannabis. There was a global trend of drug prohibition forming, initially targeting opium and cocaine via international treaties, the Hague Convention of 1912, etc., and soon extending to cannabis. Some early moves we already mentioned. Jamaica, 1913. South Africa, 1922. In the United States, at first, there wasn't much national awareness of cannabis. It wasn't widely used by Americans outside certain groups, some Mexican immigrants, and a small number of black jazz musicians and bohemians. But the term marijuana, with an H or J, started appearing in sensational news stories by the 1920 seconds, often with racist or xenophobic overtones. The fact that it was known as the Mexican loco weed meant anti-Mexican sentiment in southwestern states fueled early state bans. California, for example, outlawed preparations of hemp or loco weed as early as 1913. By the 1930 seconds, about 29 states had some form of prohibition on marijuana. Often, these laws passed quietly, as the number of users was small and marginalized, so there was little public resistance. On the international stage, cannabis was formally recognized as a controlled drug in the International Opium Convention of 1925, ironic naming aside. This Geneva Treaty, pushed in part by countries like Egypt and South Africa, who had domestic problems as they saw it, with cannabis, restricted export of Indian hemp to scientific and medicinal purposes only. It's telling that such a control was placed decades before much of the Western public even knew what marijuana was. So, a kind of legal groundwork for global prohibition was laid in the 1920 seconds. The person often central to the American cannabis prohibition story is Harry J. Anslinger, the first commissioner of the U.S. Federal Bureau of Narcotics, appointed in 1930. Anslinger made it his mission to outlaw cannabis nationwide. He and his bureau fed the press with lurid anecdotes, many of them unverifiable or exaggerated, about how marijuana caused violent crime, madness, and moral decay. Famous are the Reefer Madness style propaganda, a 1936 exploitation film, actually called Reefer Madness, depicted hapless youths descending into insanity and depravity after a few puffs of marijuana. The public, not knowing much about this drug, was susceptible to these fear campaigns. Thus, in 1937, the US Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. It effectively criminalized cannabis nationwide under the guise of a tax law requiring prohibitively difficult licensing. During the hearings, Anslinger read aloud frightening statements like, "Marijuana is an addictive drug which produces in its users insanity, criminality, and death," along with racist claims that it made black and brown men violent or look at white women twice. Only one dissenting voice, a representative of the American Medical Association, argued that the law was hasty and that cannabis had medical uses, but he was ignored. And so, with little fanfare or pushback, cannabis became illegal across the US. This set a pattern. Over the next decades, many countries aligned with the U.S. or under U.N. treaties would cement prohibitions. By 1961, the United Nations Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs placed cannabis and its resin in Schedule 4, the strictest category, alongside heroin, indicating it was considered highly dangerous and of no medical value. The world had gone from widespread traditional use and minor regulation to a near-universal ban in a relatively short time. For a moment, let's absorb what that meant on the ground. The scene of cannabis use shifted from open markets and accepted social settings into the shadows. Imagine a quiet American town in the 1940 seconds. Once upon a time, perhaps a Mexican immigrant could smoke a bit of marijuana at home after a long day in the fields, akin to how others might have a beer. Now, with law enforcement on the lookout, he has to hide this practice, fearful of being caught and jailed. Jazz musicians in Harlem or New Orleans, many of whom loved gauge or tea, slang for reefer, had to keep it secret, sharing joints in back alleys or musicians' apartments with windows carefully shuttered. A subtle transformation happened. Cannabis became countercultural by necessity, a marker of rebellion, whether the user intended it or not. During the 1940 seconds and 1950 seconds, cannabis went relatively quiet in public discourse as World War II, and then the conservative post-war era took precedence. Interestingly, there was a blip during World War II. Due to wartime fiber shortages, the US government temporarily encouraged hemp farming again, even making a film, Hemp for Victory, in 1942. But that was hemp for rope, not for smoke. And after the war, the prohibition resumed with even stricter zeal. By the late 1950 seconds, the groundwork for a cultural shift was growing. The Beat Generation poets and writers, think of Jack Kerouac, Allen Ginsberg, William S. Burroughs, openly experimented with cannabis and other drugs as part of their exploration of consciousness. They were a small bohemian set, but they planted seeds, metaphorically and literally, that would sprout in the coming decade. A young folk singer in the early 60 seconds, like Bob Dylan, would encounter marijuana via the beatnik jazz clubs in Greenwich Village, and soon it would spread into the folk and rock scenes. There is that iconic moment. Dylan reportedly introduced the Beatles to cannabis in 1964, an almost symbolic passing of the torch from the beat to the oncoming counterculture. The 1960 seconds, 1970 seconds, the counterculture's green leaf. The 1960 seconds, the decade where our gentle herb took center stage in a social revolution. Cannabis became one of the symbols of youthful rebellion, peace, and alternative lifestyle. If one closes their eyes, they can almost smell the mixture of incense and pot smoke in the air of a 1967 summer of love, gathering in San Francisco's Haight-Ashbury, or hear the strains of sitar and guitar weaving together as a circle of long-haired young people pass around a joint with flowers in their hair. Why did cannabis figure so prominently? Partly, it was timing and availability. After the war, the US had stationed many servicemen in Asia, where cannabis was accessible. Some brought back the habit. In the 60 seconds, as college enrollments soared and the civil rights and anti-war movements gained momentum, many youth questioned authority and traditional values. Trying an illegal substance was almost a political statement, rejecting the establishment's warnings. And cannabis, being relatively mild and non-addictive compared to, say, heroin, was seen as a safer way to expand consciousness or bond socially. It also fitted the ethos of peace and love better than alcohol or harder drugs, as its effects are generally relaxing, giggly, and introspective rather than aggressive. One of the great ironies is that this era's positive embrace of cannabis came exactly as law enforcement was ramping up its anti-drug campaigns. In the US, harsh penalties were introduced in the 1,950 seconds. For example, a first offense, marijuana possession, could mean years in prison, and arrests increased in the 60 seconds as usage increased. But numbers only swelled. From a fringe group in the 50 seconds, by the late 70 seconds, tens of millions of Americans had at least tried cannabis. Worldwide, a similar pattern. In the UK, in West Europe, in Australia, cannabis became the drug of choice for the new generation, to the chagrin of their elders and government. What did these counterculture cannabis scenes look like? Let's create a soft mental montage. At Woodstock 1969, 500,000 people gathered on a farm in New York for 3 days of peace and music. The rain is pouring at times, but folks are dancing, sharing food, and yes, smoking pot openly. A famous photo shows a young man offering a drag of a joint to a uniformed police officer, who politely declined. There's a communal, dreamy haze over the crowd as Joan Baez or Jimi Hendrix performs. People lay back on the grass, watching clouds and feeling at one with the music. Cannabis at that moment is almost a sacrament of communal harmony. In a more intimate setting, consider a late-night college dorm in 1971. A lava lamp glows in the corner. 4 friends sit on the floor, a Grateful Dead album playing softly. They've fashioned a crude pipe out of a piece of fruit, an apple, classic technique, and some aluminum foil. As the pipe is passed, they suppress coughs, then dissolve into laughter when someone accidentally ashes on the rug. Soon, the giggles transition into a bland, flowing conversation about life, the universe, and everything. One friend lies back, staring at the ceiling, lost in thought, but feeling a deep sense of camaraderie. Outside, maybe protests rage or personal anxieties loom, but inside that dorm room, it's a bubble of mellow contentment and understanding. Over in Jamaica, cannabis took on a renewed global significance through music. The 1,970 seconds brought reggae to the world, and with it, the face of Bob Marley became synonymous with cannabis culture. Marley, a devout Rastafarian, saw ganja as a sacred herb that facilitated insight and unity. Imagining a scene at the Hope Road studio in Kingston, Bob and the Wailers in a circle, the air heavy with the rich smell of ganja, jamming on a new song like Easy Skanking, which literally references taking it easy with a spliff. The rhythm is hypnotic, and the herb weaves into the creative process, almost like a band member. For listeners globally, the reggae beat and Marley's message of one love made cannabis seem less like a threatening narcotic and more like a natural adjunct to peaceful living. Despite this cultural wave, the establishment pushed back hard. The late 1960 seconds saw President Nixon in the US declaring a war on drugs which by the 70 seconds and 80 seconds would become a major crusade. Cannabis was labeled a Schedule 1 drug, no medical use, high abuse potential, in the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. Enforcement became stricter for a while. People were getting arrested by the tens of thousands for simple possession. Elsewhere, similar crackdown mentalities happened in some communist countries. Any drug use was harshly punished as a sign of Western decadence. In newly independent nations, there was often an effort to align with international drug control norms. However, interestingly, not all momentum was one direction. The 1970 seconds also saw the first modern decriminalization moves. In the Netherlands, the famous coffee shop system started informally around 1976, where authorities decided to tolerate retail sale of cannabis up to a small limit. Their pragmatic approach treated cannabis as a soft drug, less harmful than hard drugs, thus separating the markets and reducing harm. Several US states, Oregon, first in 1973, decriminalized small possession, meaning a fine instead of jail. So, even at the height of the crackdown elsewhere, some places experimented with leniency, reflecting a quieter undercurrent. Many saw that jailing people for a bit of weed made little sense. From a sleepy storytelling perspective, how did people quietly persist with cannabis through the war on drugs? One could imagine a farmer in Morocco's Rif Mountains in the 1980 seconds, still tending his cannabis fields as his ancestors did, despite the crop being technically illegal but largely tolerated in his remote area. He harvests the resin to make hashish, which finds its way through complex routes to Europe. On his terrace, in the evening, he smokes some of his own product in a sebsi, a long Moroccan pipe, watching the sunset over the mountains, part of a centuries-old rhythm undisturbed by outside politics. A grandmother in rural India, where ganja was only outlawed in 1985 due to international pressure, quietly prepares a bhang drink for a Hindu festival, as is tradition. She knows it's now considered illegal, but to her it's just part of the culture. She sips it in moderation and sits in the shade of her courtyard, singing a devotional song softly, feeling the mild euphoria connect her to festivities and perhaps to Lord Shiva, who is often depicted with cannabis. The legal status doesn't stop her. It barely registers in her mind compared to the weight of tradition and experience that tells her this plant is Shubha, auspicious, in the right context. A group of friends in the late 1980 seconds in a heavily policed city find a clever way to stay under the radar. They get together for what looks like a tea party. They actually bake cannabis into brownies, disguising the smell, and have an innocuous-looking plate of treats on the coffee table. As they eat the brownies, they chat normally, maybe about art or their day at work. After an hour, a gentle wave of relaxation hits them, and the giggles start. They play some cards, and one jokes that this is the highest tea they've ever had. It's a small, sly rebellion against the zero-tolerance world outside. Inside, they are in a bubble of safety and friendship, and no one is any the wiser. All through the Prohibition era, these quiet personal experiences formed a tapestry that kept cannabis culture alive beneath the official radar. And gradually, these experiences and the recognition that the sky hadn't fallen because of them led to a rethinking. By the late 1980 seconds and early 90 seconds, cracks were forming in the hardline approach, notably driven by the AIDS crisis and other compassionate use cases that put medical marijuana back on the table. Which brings us to the final leg of our journey, the contemporary era of reform and rediscovery. But before we move on, let's remember to breathe and appreciate how resilient the human-cannabis relationship has been. Empires rose and fell, laws came and went, but across time, individuals found in this plant a source of relief, creativity, and conviviality. As the 20th century ends, it's as if the long pendulum might be swinging back from fear toward understanding again. The night is always darkest before the dawn, they say. And indeed, as we enter the 21st century, a new dawn for cannabis is on the horizon. The 21st century, reforms, medical revival, and a new dawn. The 21st century has so far been a period of remarkable transformation for cannabis. After decades in the shadows, the plant has been gradually reclaimed for medicine, decriminalized, and even fully legalized in a number of places. It's as though society at large is remembering what was once common knowledge in ancient times, that cannabis can be a benevolent presence when treated with respect. This isn't to say controversy is gone, but the trend is toward a softer, more rational view. For our calm narrative, this final chapter is like the gentle morning light after a long, tumultuous night. We will summarize these developments serenely, as if telling a bedtime story where the conflicts find resolution and the characters find peace. Medical marijuana and legalization movements. The first cracks in the hard prohibition came from the medical community and activists, often motivated by compassion. In the 1980 seconds, patients with AIDS and cancer discovered that smoking cannabis relieved extreme nausea from chemotherapy and stimulated appetite in wasting syndrome. However, using it meant breaking the law. This moral conflict, patients alleviating suffering but considered criminals, galvanized change. In 1996, California became the pioneer by legalizing cannabis for medical use. Proposition 215. I remember how controversial yet hopeful that felt. Images of very ill patients, some even in wheelchairs, celebrating because they could now access their medicine without fear. That was a profound shift. It reintroduced cannabis into the pharmacopoeia, legally, at least at a state level. Canada, followed by creating a federal medical cannabis program in 2001, the first country to do so broadly. Over the next 2 decades, the dominoes kept falling. Europe, Latin America, even some Asian countries allowed limited medical use. By the mid-2010 seconds, medical marijuana was legal in dozens of US states and many countries. The plant was helping people with conditions like chronic pain, epilepsy, certain compounds like CBD, showing dramatic effects against childhood seizure disorders, PTSD, anxiety, and more. Imagine a scene in the mid-2000s, a medical cannabis dispensary in California. It's a clean, calm space, more spa than head shop. Soft music plays. A patient, say, a middle-aged woman with multiple sclerosis, enters with her doctor's recommendation. The staff greet her kindly. In glass jars, various strains of dried cannabis flowers glisten under the lights, each labeled with names like Blue Dream or Granddaddy Purple, and notes about their effects: relaxing, uplifting, pain relief, etc. The woman discusses with a knowledgeable buttender what might help her muscle spasms and help her sleep. She decides on a particular strain, perhaps even an edible chocolate to avoid smoking. She leaves with a little brown bag, like someone who just visited an herbal apothecary, which, in essence, she did. The entire experience is dignified and relieving, free of the fear and stigma that once shadowed such transactions on the street corner. It must feel empowering and normalizing for her to take control of her condition with a plant remedy she can trust. On the recreational legalization front, the tide turned more slowly but definitively. In 2012, voters in Colorado and Washington State, USA, approved full legalization for adult use. This was historic, the first jurisdictions to dismantle prohibition entirely for personal enjoyment, not just medical. Implementation came with regulation, licensed stores, age limits, taxes. It was a bold experiment that, as years passed, appeared successful by many measures. Big tax revenue, no significant public health disaster, even possibly reduced opioid death rates in states with legal cannabis, as some studies noted. Uruguay became the first entire country to legalize in 2013 with a state-controlled model. Canada followed suit in 2018, fully legalizing cannabis nationwide. By the mid-2020s, a wave of change rolled across Europe, with countries like Germany moving toward partial legalization. Parts of Asia, Thailand legalized medical, and then even personal cultivation in a stunning move. And Africa, South Africa's court ruled home use legal, etc. Even at the United Nations, in 2020, cannabis was rescheduled to acknowledge medical value, a symbolic but significant move. Now, consider the atmosphere in a place that has newly legalized. Let's pick Colorado around 2014. A young couple stroll into one of Denver's first legal cannabis boutiques. They show ID to prove they're over 21, then browse. It feels a bit like a cross between a coffee shop and a small wine store. There's a menu on the wall listing different strains, each with THC, percentages, and perhaps the terpene profiles, the aromatic compounds that give flavors. They choose a pre-rolled joint of a mild strain, and perhaps a cannabis-infused bath balm as a novelty. That evening, at home, they light the joint on their porch as the sun sets. They puff gently, passing it back and forth, just as maybe their parents did secretly decades ago. But now it's legal, and that removal of fear makes it all the more relaxing. They watch the sky change colors and share a comfortable silence. Maybe they discuss a funny memory or marvel at the taste. Some modern strains have wonderful hints of citrus or pine. They are experiencing what generations before them have, but with a newfound acceptance around it. It's just a peaceful pastime now, akin to having a glass of wine. The world didn't end. In fact, in that moment, the world seems pretty beautiful and tranquil to them. Another scenario. An elderly man in Canada in 2019 with arthritis decides to visit a legal shop for a CBD-rich tincture. CBD is a non-intoxicating component known to help inflammation. He was once wary of marijuana, having grown up in a prohibition era, but seeing the science and how mainstream it's become, he gives it a try. At home, he rubs the tincture on his achy knees and perhaps tries a tiny bit of a THC oil at night to help sleep. To his pleasant surprise, he finds relief without the side effects he felt on previous pain meds. In the morning, he tends his garden a bit more comfortably. He chuckles to himself that in his twilight years, he's become a cannabis patient, something he'd never have imagined, but it feels natural, not scandalous. The stigma has melted away, and it's simply about wellness. Of course, the legal landscape is patchwork globally as of 2025. Some places still have strict bans, and many people remain incarcerated or with ruined lives due to past enforcement of harsh laws. A sobering reality, even as we celebrate progress. Social justice has become part of the cannabis reform conversation, expunging records of those convicted of minor offences, ensuring the new industry benefits communities hit hard by the drug war, etc. These are the challenges of this era, being addressed gradually. On the scientific front, the endocannabinoid system, the receptors in our bodies that respond to cannabis compounds, was discovered in the 1990 seconds and has opened whole new understanding of human biology. Cannabis is being studied seriously again, as it was in the 19th century, for conditions like epilepsy, chronic pain, and even potentially as adjunct cancer therapies. The plant is yielding secrets, not just THC and CBD, but 100 plus cannabinoids, each with potential effects, plus terpenes that may modulate the experience, the so-called entourage effect. We are essentially rediscovering what ancient healers might have sensed intuitively, that cannabis is a multifaceted apothecary in one. One can imagine in a lab, somewhere, a researcher in a white coat, gently swirling a vial with a cannabis extract, isolating a compound that could become a new medicine for anxiety without the side effects of current drugs. In the greenhouse next door, carefully cultivated cannabis plants bask under full-spectrum lights, their distinct aromas wafting. One smells of lavender and pepper, perhaps high in linalool and caryophyllene terpenes, which might be particularly good for stress relief. It's a merging of traditional botanical knowledge and cutting-edge science, hand in hand, aimed at improving lives. Culturally, cannabis in the 2020 seconds is arguably normalizing. It's not just counterculture now. It's in mom-and-pop wellness shops as CBD lotions. It's discussed in government policy meetings. It's something a grandparent might openly talk about trying for their back pain. There are even upscale cannabis dinners, where gourmet chefs pair strains with dishes to enhance flavors, turning what was once an illicit snack of brownies into a refined culinary art. And yet, the heart of it remains the same simple experience, a person and a plant connecting. As we coast toward the conclusion of our soothing history, let's cast our mind's eye on a possible near-future scene that encapsulates this new era. It's evening in a city where cannabis is legal. In a public park, there's a small gathering for a yoga and meditation event under the stars. Participants are welcome to partake in a bit of cannabis beforehand, if they wish, to enhance relaxation. Optional, of course. A few do, perhaps using a small vaporizer pen or nibbling a low-dose herbal gummy. The group then sits on mats, breathing deeply, as an instructor guides them through gentle stretches and a mindfulness meditation. The cannabis, for those who chose it, works subtly, helping some to quiet their racing thoughts and tune into the present moment. The sound of crickets, the feel of the breeze, the dim outline of trees against the night sky. After the session, people share some tea and hushed conversation about how peaceful they feel. In this scenario, cannabis has returned to a sacred, healthful context, reminiscent of its roles in ancient spiritual practices, but now within a modern, inclusive community setting. It's not about intoxication per se, it's about enhancing wellness and human connection. To close our narrative, cannabis and humanity have a long, entwined history. We've journeyed from prehistory, where hemp fibers helped civilization get literally off the ground, through religious rituals where smoke carried prayers, to medical potions easing pain, to being vilified and driven underground, and finally toward re-acceptance and scientific understanding. Through all these changes, one can't help but sense that the plant itself has been a constant, patient presence, like an old tree that witnesses empires rise and fall while offering shade through it all. In the quiet hours of the night, as you drift to sleep having heard this tale, consider how cyclical history is. What was once seen as a gift from the gods became a feared devil's weed and is now re-emerging as a helpful friend. Perhaps there's a lesson in tolerance and open-mindedness in that cycle. Like any tool or ally, cannabis reflected how society chose to use or abuse it. Now, with wiser eyes and perhaps a slightly dreamy, half-closed gaze if you're feeling sleepy, we may integrate this ancient plant into modern life with balance and respect. As our story ends, picture a gentle scene. A garden at dusk anywhere in the world. Could be a rice paddy in India, a cabin in Colorado, or a rooftop in Italy. A person sits quietly, a cup of hemp-infused tea in hand. The day's work is done. The sky transitions from orange to deep blue. They sip slowly, feeling a light relaxation in their body and a soft clarity in their mind. A sense of gratitude wells up. Gratitude for the day, for the earth that grows such healing herbs, for the simple fact of being alive right now. This calm moment, in essence, is what cannabis has given to people for ages. A chance to pause, to find comfort, to feel a touch more connected to nature and each other. In the end, it's a boring little history indeed. Just people finding ways to soothe the body and soul in an often challenging world. And so, dear listener, our journey through time comes to rest. When did people start smoking weed and more? Long ago, in the cradles of civilization, and they never truly stopped. The practice only evolved, weathering storms of change. Now, you can gently close your eyes, knowing this story, like the rising smoke of an incense, has drifted through eons and lands and has now come to you, only to dissolve softly into the still night air. May your sleep be as peaceful as the ancient shepherd resting by his hemp fire under the stars, as restorative as the healer's deep inhalation of sacred smoke in a temple, and as gentle as the modern dreamer's content smile after a little evening herb. Sweet dreams, and thank you for listening to this long, quiet story of cannabis and humanity.